We're going to be talking about optionals, and I'm going to be using Swift Playgrounds for this. You are free to use Xcode Playgrounds, but I like Swift Playgrounds. It's fast. The key thing though is to get to Swift only mode is you have to go to File and New Book. And now we're just going to wait for it to give me my code. Here we go. Alright, so let's talk about optionals. Let me make this full screen by dragging it up to the top of my screen. And the key thing is that optionals is a concept that you might need to know for Swift. You probably don't need to know it in much detail, but you are going to encounter it on more than one occasion. So you might say that it's not entirely optional. I am sorry. Let's carry on. So you might have seen this thing called nil when you've been creating some Swift UI views. It's just when something doesn't exist or a way to not give an argument to a function. And nil is different from 0 and is different from an empty string. And the reason for that is that Swift has to make a distinction between empty data and non-existent data. So I'm just going to quickly type out some code to show you the difference. So let's say you have a student struct. And let me increase the font size a bit. Here we go. And students have names. Students have favorite foods. Or do they? Alright, so here we go. This is a simple struct, and let's say you're creating a student. Student1 equals to student, and let's say name YJ, favorite food is obviously Nutella. Okay, so that's great. But what if there's another student who has no favorite food? So let's call this ZK, and favorite food. What are we going to put here? We can't actually just put this thing called nil, which I mentioned just now, because that is a different type from string. So we have to put a string, and one way you can do it is just by putting an empty string, but that's not great because it's pretty error prone and someone might actually go fill it in with something else. Okay, so the solution is to make it optional. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make this into an optional string. I'm just going to put in a question mark after the word string. And what that does is it changes it to a brand new type. Okay, so instead of this thing being a string and string only, it can now either take nil or a string. So Swift continues to be very strict about type safety, but a nil value is fine if you define a type as an optional string. Okay, so once again, an optional is a type of variable which kind of wraps around a base type. It can have a value of nil, or it can have a value equivalent to the base type. In this case, a string question mark, which is called an optional string, can be nil, it can be Nutella, it can be cucumbers, but why would it ever be cucumbers? Alright, so that's just what an optional is. Let's now explore actually creating some optionals. I'm going to first create an int that is 4. Okay, I'm going to leave the type annotation there for clarity. And I'm going to create something called optional num that is an int question mark, and I'm also going to set it to 4. To us, these look like the same, but one key difference is that an optional num can be set to nil. Okay, in fact, you can create another optional num and immediately set it to nil with the expectation that perhaps you will set it to be something else afterwards. Alright, so if I remove this line though, you might be thinking, okay, well, this is 4 and this is 4. We should be able to add these together. Let's try. That a equals to num plus optional num. Okay, and you're going to find that Swift is not going to have any of that. That is not how type safety works. You cannot add an int and an optional int. Okay, so this is one of the key things about Swift. You're not allowed to add things of two different types, no matter how similar they look. How are you going to fix this? Well, there's a few suggestions here. I'm going to point out the one that I would rather you not do, and that is force unwrap using exclamation mark. Okay, so I'm going to click on this. And what that does is, you see a question mark here? Well, let's put an exclamation mark and everything seems to work. Okay, and let me just prove this to you. I'm going to press run my code and it's happily going to work. And I think we can print out A and we can see what it is. We can go check our console and the console says 8. Great, we managed to add 4 plus 4, even with optionals. Now, why don't I recommend you do this? Because one of the things that the error message mentioned was that there's going to be consequences if something goes wrong. It says force unwrap using exclamation mark to abort execution if the optional value contains nil. Abort execution means crash. So let me just show you this example. If I say another optional num over here and I put an exclamation mark, Swift will say, okay, that seems fine, but when you actually run the code, that is when stuff goes haywire and you get a crash. It looks fine here, but if you're doing this on an actual app, you are going to end up with a crashing app. So you have to be very careful. Okay, so let's go through how we actually want to do this. The safest way to work with optionals is to check if the value is nil before we unwrap it. Okay, so you might hear me say this thing called unwrap. Treat an optional as a gift box. You don't know what's in the gift box, but you also want to be careful in case someone puts socks in your gift box. Okay, so let's go check what the optional is. I'm going to say var b equals to 0, right? So this is to create a variable to add to. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say if the optional num is not equals to nil, right? Then we know it's safe to unwrap and this optional box doesn't come with socks. Okay, we're going to say b equals to num plus optional num exclamation mark. Okay, so now we know that this exclamation mark right here is safe to do because you're not going to end up having it crash your program. All right, so let's run this real quick and this should work. Okay, you should get something over here that says your b is 8. And even if you were to set optional num to be nil before this happened, optional num equals to nil. If I try and run this, it's perfectly harmless, nothing crashes. Okay, so this is all right. It's a pretty decent way of working with optionals, but there's an even better method, and that's called optional binding. All right, so I'm going to replace all this with something new. It's going to be if let unwrapped num equals to optional num, open curly brace, b equals to num plus unwrapped num. Okay. By the way, for all of these, you can put an else statement and you can print out what happens if this condition failed. All right. But this thing over here is called if let. And what this means is that you are binding the value of the optional to a new value. And inside this set of curly braces, this value exists and it's an int, not an optional. So you don't need to unwrap it anymore. If this was nil to begin with, then this if statement will fail and you will not execute what's inside here. All right, so let's run this to test it out real quick. So if I run it one time with this thing equals to 4, it works perfectly fine. I get 8. And if I bring back the line that says optional num equals to nil, preferably by spelling it correctly, I'm going to see that this code never actually runs and my code doesn't crash. Okay, so that's pretty nice, but there's a bit of extra optimization that we can do. You can use a shorthand that says, okay, well, this unwrapped num thing, it's kind of weird. You're just creating this variable for use inside this set of curly braces. Let's save ourselves some typing and not introduce a new variable name. I'm just going to delete this away and I'm going to use optional num over here. Okay. So what this if let statement does is it checks optional num. Okay, it's kind of like a bouncer. It says, hey, optional num, you're here. Are you nil? If you are nil, we're not going to let you in. We can bounce you over here and maybe there's an else statement that we can print out to say, hey, error, this thing was nil. If you aren't nil, on the other hand, that's great. We are going to assign a variable inside the set of curly braces that is actually an unwrapped version of you, which means that this thing over here is an int and it can be added to this int without having to use an exclamation mark. All right, this part is pretty tricky to understand, but once you're used to it, it should become second nature. Okay, so just to reiterate, if let will check whether this is nil. If it is, nope, good, it exits. But if it's not nil, well, now this block over here has optional num, and optional num is now an unwrapped version of itself. So if optional num used to be an int question mark, now it's just an int inside the scope of these curly braces. Okay, you might also see some people type it this way. And this is the pre-2022 syntax. If you see it typed online, that's okay. You can just treat it as this syntax. This method will not work if you're trying to use an optional property in a struct. Let me just show you what I mean. So for example, if I have a student, I could say if let favorite food equals to student1 dot favorite food. All right, then I can print student1 has a favorite. There's no way for me to make this into a shorthand by just saying if let favorite food, okay, because it doesn't exist outside of student1. So that's one thing to take note of. Okay. Next, I want to talk about something called guard let, which you might see in your SwiftUI code. Let me just press enter a whole bunch of times. Okay. Up here, I'm going to create a function that says evaluate number, and I'm going to ask the user for their favorite number as a string. And one thing you might want to do when you receive a number that is a string is you might want to cast it to an integer so you can do stuff with it, right? And you could do this. You could say let number equals to int, open bracket, user favorite number, okay? And what this does is it will try its best to convert this thing into an integer. Now, you might see the problem here. Someone might enter for their favorite number, potato. And if you try and convert potato to an integer, that's going to fail. And that's one great use of optionals, because if it fails, then this function over here, this casting to an int, should return nil. Okay, so let's just print this out real quick. Print out number. And let's see what happens. I'm going to say evaluate number with potato. And I'm going to run my code. All right, you will see that this thing kind of fails. And when it prints, it says nil. Okay, so instead of letting it fail, we might want to just exit from this function. The way we do that is by using something called guard let. Okay, so guard let number equals to int user favorite number, else print that wasn't a number, and return. Okay, so what this does is fairly interesting in the sense that afterwards, once you're past this guard let block, the rest of the function can use this number over here as a straight up integer. So I'm just going to show you what happens if I give something that can be converted into an integer like 100. And I'm going to press run my code and I'm going to show you the two outcomes. There you go. The first one says that wasn't a number. Second time round, it actually reached this line of code and I could use number. Number here is an integer, not an optional. Okay, so you're going to see this all over SwiftUI functions. I'm not sure how often you'll actually be using it, but it is something to take note of. That's guard let. Here's another example. This is about implicitly unwrapped optionals. So let's say I have greeting1 equals to good, and I have greeting2, which is a string exclamation mark, right? And we know we'll set this later. Okay, and I'm going to say let time equals to 5. And I'm going to say, if the time is less than 9, we're going to say, greeting2 equals to morning. And else greeting2 equals to day, something like that. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go create a full greeting equals to greeting1 plus greeting2. All right. Okay. And I'm going to run my code. You're going to see that there's, first of all, no errors, and full greeting works perfectly fine, although I kind of forgot to put a space. And one thing you'll notice is that even though this thing is not quite a string, it's a string with an exclamation mark attached, it actually can be added to greeting1. This thing over here is called an implicitly unwrapped optional. It's like me saying, let me create a variable with no value for now, but when you need it later, it will definitely have a value. If it doesn't have a value, you can crash. Okay. And because this if statement takes care of assigning a value to it, we are perfectly fine. And we can use this without having to unwrap. Okay, so that's pretty cool. The last thing I want to show you is called nil coalescing. We actually saw this just now in an error. So I'm just going to go all the way back up here. Remember var num and optional num. I'm going to use those two. I'm going to say var sum equals to num plus optional num. Okay, and I'm going to wait for Swift Playgrounds to tell me that it can't be done because I want to show you the other option. There's this thing over here that says coalesce using question mark to provide a default when the original value contains nil. That doesn't sound like it makes any sense. I'm just going to press fixed. Okay, And we get this thing over here that says optional num, question mark, default value, and this is a placeholder, so you just put 0. What this means is that if this isn't nil, we're going to use the value, but if it is nil, I'm just going to use 0. Okay, so let's run the code real quick, and you're going to see that it works perfectly fine. It's actually 4, because I think we set optional num to be nil at some point earlier on. I think it was right here. Okay, if I take this away and I run my code again, I think it should give me 8, just as we expected. Okay, so that's nil coalescing. The idea here is that you're just going to say your optional over here, put question mark, and then the default value to take if it turns out to be nil. Okay, all right, let's talk a little bit more about optionals in practice. When might you see them? When might you use them? Okay, so let's talk about a person like a professional, right? A professional working adult. You are probably interested in this person's name, and you are probably interested in their credit card number. I'm going to use something called a uint64 to store the right number of numbers because it's quite a lot of digits. Okay, but what if this person doesn't have a credit card number? Okay, so you know what? You can make this optional. All right. And what's interesting about this is that it affects the initializer that you get. You could say var person goes to professional with name and credit card number. So name could be YJ and YJ's credit card number is obviously something like this. Please don't try and use it. Okay. But maybe a young person who just started work hasn't applied for a credit card yet. Okay. Not enough line of credit. Could be professional with just name. Okay. Someone else. All right. So in that case, when you create this professional object, credit card number will default to nil. Okay. Another way you might see optionals in SwiftUI is that you might see functions that return optionals. And we saw that one just now. That was in int. Okay, so essentially this int converter from a string says, hey, I'm not sure if this will really succeed. If it doesn't succeed, I'll just return you nil and you can deal with it. Another place you might encounter optionals is in SwiftUI. So over here, if I type vstack, okay, you might see over here that for vstack, it takes in alignment, spacing, and content. We know that content is compulsory, so it's not in italics. If you look carefully over here, it says that spacing is actually a CG float question mark. That means that it's an optional floating point number. If it's nil, then vstack knows what to do. It'll just apply the default spacing. Alignment, however, is not a required parameter, but it's not using the optional type. Okay, that's probably because it's got a default value to begin with. Okay, so what this means is that if I create a vstack with alignment :leading and a vstack with alignment :leading and spacing of nil, these two vstacks are actually equivalent. And that's our introduction to optionals.